Okay, so buckle up because this deep dive is going to get cosmic. We're going deep into some pretty out there theories about the Vatican and extraterrestrials.
Sounds intriguing.
Oh, it is. We've got this article called How the Vatican is Preparing to Welcome the Antichrist.
Wow. Okay. That's a pretty bold title.
Yeah, you could say that. But tucked inside are these fascinating claims about how the Vatican might actually be pretty open to the idea of alien life.
Really? The Vatican?
Right. You wouldn't expect, and they get right to it, too. Like, right off the bat, they start talking about this telescope called LUCIFER that the Vatican supposedly has hidden away in Arizona.
Okay. LUCIFER. Now, that's a name that's going to raise some eyebrows.
Yeah, no kidding. Apparently, it's run by Jesuit priests, too.
Jesuit priests running a telescope called LUCIFER. I mean, it's definitely catchy.
Right. You got to wonder what they're looking for up there.
I think it's meant to be pretty provocative. It kind of sets the tone for the whole article. This idea that the Vatican is actively searching for proof of life beyond Earth.
Yeah, and maybe even embracing it, which is pretty wild considering their whole, religious doctrine thing.
Definitely a bit of a contrast there. And speaking of unexpected takes, this article goes on to talk about the famous 1917 Marian apparition at Fatima, Portugal.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. The Virgin Mary appearing to 3 shepherd children, right.
That's the one. It's like one of the biggest events in Catholic history. And this article suggests that the Vatican might be reinterpreting it.
Reinterpreting it? As what?
Well, they imply that the Vatican is considering the possibility that it wasn't the Virgin Mary at all.
You're kidding?
Nope. They're suggesting it could have been an encounter with extraterrestrials.
Wow. That's a bold claim.
It is. And they don't stop there. They even quote a couple of Jesuit priests, Father Consolmagno and Father Giuseppe Tenzellaniti.
And what do they say?
These priests actually suggest that visits from aliens are not just possible, but imminent.
Imminent, like they're about to happen.
That's what they seem to be implying. And get this, they even hint that contact with extraterrestrials could lead to some major revisions in core Christian beliefs.
Seriously, that's a pretty radical idea.
It is. And it leads to this question, are these just fringe views within the church? Or is there something more to it? Like, could the Vatican actually be preparing for a future where we're interacting with alien life?
Makes you wonder what they know.
Yeah, it does. But then the article takes a bit of a darker turn. They start connecting this whole extraterrestrial thing to the coming of the Antichrist.
Whoa, hold on. The Antichrist, how did they get there?
Well, they talk about this idea of a great leader who'll come along offering solutions to all the world's problems. And they suggest that this leader might actually be the Antichrist in disguise, using his charisma and wisdom to deceive humanity.
So they're saying the Vatican is worried about this.
That's the gist of it. It's a pretty bleak outlook. But it's important to remember that this is just one interpretation of a very complex issue. We need to dig deeper and see what evidence they have to support these claims. And maybe look at some other perspectives too.
I'm definitely intrigued. So let's unpack all of this, shall we?
Okay, so let's rewind a bit and go back to that LUCIFER telescope.
Yeah.
The article makes it sound like this top secret Vatican project hidden out in the desert.
Yeah, like something out of a movie.
Right. But is there any truth to that?
Well, I mean, the Vatican does have an observatory, right?
They do. The Vatican Observatory is a real thing. And it's actually one of the oldest astronomical research institutions in the world. It dates back to the 16th century.
Wow, so they've been into astronomy for a while.
Oh, yeah, for centuries. And they do have a telescope on Mount Graham in Arizona. That's where this LUCIFER thing comes from.
So it's a real telescope.
It is. It's a real telescope with a very interesting name.
Yeah, no kidding. But is it some secret Vatican operation?
Not really. It's actually part of a collaboration with other institutions, like the University of Arizona and a German research group.
So they're working with other scientists.
Exactly. It's not some isolated Vatican project. They're part of the scientific community.
Okay, so what about the Jesuit priests who are supposedly running it? Are they the ones searching for aliens?
Well, the Vatican Observatory does employ Jesuit priests, but they're also trained astronomers.
So they're scientists.
Yes. Their work is based on scientific observation and analysis, just like any other astronomer.
So they might be open to the idea of extraterrestrial life, but they're approaching it from a scientific perspective.
Exactly. They're not out there trying to prove the Bible or anything like that. They're studying things like galaxy formation, stellar evolution, cosmology.
That's pretty cool, actually.
Oh, yeah, it is. It's fascinating stuff. And it seems like the articles may be mixing up their scientific work with this whole Antichrist apocalypse scenario.
Yeah, it's a pretty big leap to go from studying stars to preparing for the end of the world.
It is. And I think it speaks to this tendency to view scientific discoveries through a religious lens.
That brings us to the other big claim from the article, the whole reinterpretation of the Fatima incident.
Ah, yes, Fatima, one of the most famous events in Catholic history. And this article is suggesting that the Vatican might be reconsidering its stance on it.
Which is a pretty huge deal considering how important Fatima is to Catholics.
Exactly. And they're basically implying that what those children saw might not have been the Virgin Mary.
But if it wasn't Mary, then who or what was it?
Well, they seem to be hinting at the possibility that it was an encounter with extraterrestrials.
Whoa. Okay, so are they saying the Vatican is actually buying into that?
It's hard to say. There's no official indication that the Vatican is changing its position on Fatima. The event is still officially recognized as a Marian apparition.
So the article might be stretching the truth a bit.
It's possible. I think it's important to distinguish between official church doctrine and the personal opinions of individual members of the clergy.
Right, like those Jesuit priests we talked about earlier.
Exactly. They were expressing their personal views, not speaking on behalf of the entire church.
So their opinions are interesting, but they don't necessarily represent what the Vatican as a whole believes.
Right. It's all about context and nuance. And the church has a long history of engaging with scientific discoveries and adapting its teachings over time.
Okay, that makes sense. So while the article makes some pretty wild claims, it's important to remember that it's just one perspective on a complex issue.
Exactly. And there's another interesting layer to this whole thing. The location of the Vatican Observatory on Mount Graham.
Mount Graham?
Yeah. It's a really beautiful place with a lot of cultural significance.
How so?
Well, for one thing, it's a biodiversity hotspot, home to several endangered species. And it also holds deep spiritual significance for the Apache people. They consider it sacred ground.
I see. But the article kind of spins this in a different direction, right?
They do. They start talking about satanic rituals and alien encounters on Mount Graham. Yeah, it's getting into pre-sensational territory. And I think it's important to be careful with those kinds of claims.
Especially when it comes to a place that's sacred to indigenous people.
Exactly. We need to be respectful of their beliefs and traditions.
So it seems like the article is using the cultural significance of Mount Graham to add another layer of intrigue to their story.
I think that's a fair assessment. They're weaving together religion, science, indigenous cultures, conspiracy theories. It's a pretty compelling mix.
But as we've been discussing, it's important to approach these claims with a critical eye.
Absolutely. We need to consider the broader context and remember that the article is just one interpretation of a very complicated subject.
Right. It's all about asking questions, challenging assumptions, and trying to get a more nuanced understanding of things. Wow. This deep dive has taken us on quite a ride, from telescopes with crazy names to ancient prophecies and alien encounters.
It's amazing how all these different threads can come together. You know, science, religion, history, even conspiracy theories. It all gets mixed up into this really fascinating narrative.
But as we've seen, not all of those narratives are actually based on facts.
That's true. Sometimes it's more about interpretation, speculation, even sensationalism.
Right. The article we've been talking about is really just one perspective on this whole extraterrestrial thing.
Exactly. And they're connecting a lot of dots that might not actually be related.
Yeah, like that whole thing about the Vatican's interest in aliens being linked to the Antichrist.
Right. That's a pretty big jump to make. And it's based on a very specific theological viewpoint.
And we have to remember that not everyone shares that viewpoint.
Exactly. Even within the Catholic Church, there's a lot of diversity of thought and interpretation.
Like with those Jesuit priests we talked about. They had some interesting opinions, but they weren't speaking for the entire church.
It's a good reminder that even within big institutions like the Vatican, there's room for individual perspectives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest thing is to be skeptical, especially when you're dealing with topics that mix science and religion and speculation.
Right. It's all about asking critical questions.
Exactly. Who's presenting this information? What's their agenda? What evidence do they have?
And we have to be aware of our own biases, too.
Absolutely. We all come to these topics with our own beliefs and preconceived notions. And it's important to recognize how that might influence our interpretation.
It's about being an active participant in the conversation, not just passively taking in information.
Right. Do your own research, consider different viewpoints, and come to your own conclusions.
That's what makes these deep dives so interesting. It's not about finding all the answers. It's about exploring ideas, challenging our assumptions, and expanding our understanding of the world.
Couldn't agree more. It's an ongoing journey of discovery and critical thinking.
Well, our minds have definitely been stretched today, that's for sure.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the vastness of space to the complexities of religious doctrine.
And we've been left with some thought-provoking questions, which is always a good thing.
It's those unanswered questions that keep us curious and searching and learning.
So for our listeners, we'll leave you with this final thought. Does the Vatican's interest in extraterrestrials challenge their traditional beliefs? Or could it actually strengthen their faith in ways we might not fully understand? It's something to think about. And maybe even explore further on your own.